breaking news. At a NATO press briefing this morning, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stunned the world. In less than 10 minutes, he delivered a warning so fierce that the room went completely silent, leaving President Trump scrambling behind closed doors. For months, the United States has tried to intimidate Canada, imposing tariffs, questioning sovereignty, and demanding compliance. Today, Carney flipped the entire script. No threats, no empty promises, just clear, unyielding demands that the United States must meet within 14 days or face consequences that could reshape North America forever. This isn't diplomacy as usual. This is a full-blown power play, and the world is watching. Mark Carney entered the NATO press room with the confidence of a man who knows he holds the upper hand. Within seconds of speaking, he made it clear that Canada would no longer be bullied, manipulated, or undermined by the United States. Carney's message was simple, direct, and unprecedented. If the U.S. does not comply with Canada's 5 specific demands within 14 days, the consequences will be immediate, severe, and unavoidable. The press room fell silent. Reporters and diplomats alike sensed that this was not just another statement. It was a turning point. For weeks, the United States had pushed Canada, issuing threats and expecting compliance. Trump's administration assumed that economic and political pressure would force concessions, that Canada would eventually bow to the dominant power. Carney, however, had spent these weeks quietly preparing a response that was not only strategic but devastatingly effective. By the time he spoke, Canada had contingency plans in place, alternative trade partners secured, and international allies briefed and ready to support any measures necessary. In his opening remarks, Carney framed the crisis in stark terms. He told NATO officials and the global press that Canada's sovereignty had been challenged, its economy threatened, and its international standing undermined. Yet, Carney emphasized, Canada had responded with patience, strategic planning, and diplomacy until now. He declared that the U.S. had consistently refused reasonable negotiation, leaving Canada with no choice but to assert its rights on its own terms. Every word was calculated, designed to demonstrate strength, resolve, and the credibility of Canada's red line. Carney then unveiled the 5 demands that would define the next 2 weeks. First, he demanded the complete removal of all U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods. Carney made it clear there would be no negotiations, no phased reductions, and no exceptions. The tariffs are illegal under USMCA, he said, and they must be removed entirely or there is no path forward. The room reacted immediately, recognizing the economic implications not just for Canadian exports, but for industries across the United States, from agriculture to manufacturing to energy. Second, Carney required a binding commitment to NORAD and intelligence sharing. He insisted that the U.S. guarantee, in writing, that continental defense agreements would remain intact, and that intelligence sharing through the Five Eyes network would continue without interference. This was not a symbolic demand. Canada had made clear that any unilateral withdrawal or weakening of these arrangements would trigger immediate countermeasures. The United States could no longer assume that military cooperation would remain unquestioned. Third, Carney demanded a public retraction of any sovereignty threats. In his speech, he highlighted specific instances in which U.S. officials, including President Trump, had suggested Canadian provinces could be incorporated into the United States. Canada is a sovereign nation, Carney stated. Our territorial integrity is not subject to American political commentary. This statement, delivered with unwavering confidence, marked a historic moment, a Canadian leader calling out a sitting U.S. president on the international stage without fear of reprisal. Fourth, Carney outlined compensation for the economic damage caused by the tariffs. Canada calculated the total losses at $14.7 billion, encompassing disrupted trade, supply chain losses, and costs associated with building alternative partnerships. Carney made it explicit that this compensation could take the form of direct payment, trade credits, or infrastructure investment, but it must be acknowledged and delivered. There would be no ambiguity, no delay, and no loopholes. Finally, Carney demanded formal recognition of Canadian resource sovereignty. He stated that all Canadian natural resources, oil, gas, electricity, critical minerals, are Canadian property and must be sold under terms determined by Canada. Any U.S. attempt to secure preferential access or guaranteed supply without negotiation would be considered a violation of sovereignty, triggering immediate consequences. The message was clear: Canada was not negotiating favors, it was setting the rules. Even as Carney delivered these demands, the press and diplomats could sense the underlying threat. These were not idle words. Canada had prepared measures that would cripple the U.S. economy, disrupt energy markets, and force Trump into an impossible decision. Every tariff, every supply chain, every defense arrangement was now leverage in a high-stakes game of strategy and national pride. Carney's 14-day deadline was not arbitrary. It was designed to maximize pressure, ensuring that the U.S. could not delay, ignore, or dismiss Canada's authority without facing immediate, tangible consequences. Within minutes, Washington went into crisis mode. Senior officials reportedly held emergency meetings, economists began calculating potential market collapses, and energy traders started pricing in the risk of Canadian exports being redirected to Europe and Asia. Carney's speech had accomplished what months of diplomacy had not. It shifted the balance of power, leaving the United States reacting rather than controlling the narrative. The first section of this unfolding drama ends with a chilling realization. Carney's ultimatum is credible, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Canada has drawn a line, the clock is ticking, and the United States has 14 days to decide whether it will comply, negotiate, or face consequences that could permanently alter the geopolitical landscape. Markets, allies, and military planners are all watching. The world has never seen a Canadian leader take such a bold stance, and Trump has never faced a challenge of this magnitude in his presidency. Within minutes of Carney's speech, the atmosphere in Washington shifted from disbelief to panic. Senior officials at the National Security Council reportedly held emergency meetings behind closed doors, their conversations tense and fragmented. The question dominating every briefing room was the same: is Canada serious? Every U.S. intelligence assessment pointed to one inescapable truth: Carney was not bluffing. For 5 weeks, Canada had quietly fortified its economic, military, and diplomatic leverage. They had alternative trade agreements lined up, European allies briefed, and financial systems prepared to absorb the shock of cutting U.S. ties. Trump's administration suddenly realized that for the first time in this crisis, they were on the defensive. The clock was ticking. March 18th, the 14-day deadline, was no longer a distant threat. It was an imminent reality. Economists in Washington and New York began modeling worst-case scenarios. The removal of Canadian energy exports alone could push gasoline and electricity prices sky high, disrupting industries across the Midwest and Northeast. Analysts predicted that a full suspension of energy shipments could trigger immediate supply shortages in manufacturing, transportation, and critical infrastructure sectors. Every second Carney's ultimatum remained unanswered. The pressure on Trump and his advisors grew exponentially. Inside the White House, sources claim the mood was chaotic. Trump reportedly demanded options that could punish Canada harder than Canada could punish the U.S. Advisors explained that Canada had already neutralized any effective retaliation. U.S. tariffs were meaningless without Canadian compliance. Energy access could not be easily replaced, and alternative trade routes were already being negotiated with Europe and Asia. Every strategy Trump had relied on for months to intimidate Canada had evaporated. For the first time, the administration faced a crisis it could not control, and the international media sensed the vulnerability immediately. NATO allies watched silently, stunned. Carney's address wasn't limited to Canada-U.S. relations, it was a global statement. By delivering this ultimatum at a NATO press event, he ensured that Europe, Asia, and other key powers witnessed Canada asserting sovereignty and forcing a superpower to comply on short notice. Diplomats from Germany, France, and the UK reportedly exchanged astonished glances. In essence, Carney was signaling that Canada's alliances and alternative partnerships were ready to enforce the demands if the U.S. refused. For NATO members, this was a message that power dynamics were shifting, and they would be forced to consider Canada as an equal, not a junior partner in North America. Markets reacted almost instantaneously. Within an hour of the speech, energy futures began to spike. Traders rushed to calculate the impact of halted oil, gas, and electricity exports to the United States. Utilities and industrial sectors dependent on Canadian power began issuing emergency statements, prompting ripple effects across the financial system. The Dow Jones fell sharply, erasing gains from the previous week, while the S&P 500 and NASDAQ experienced sudden volatility. Wall Street was beginning to price in the catastrophic potential of Carney's ultimatum. This was no longer speculation, it was a probable scenario. Meanwhile, global media framed the situation as unprecedented. Headlines in London, Berlin, Tokyo, and Sydney highlighted Carney's audacity, emphasizing that Canada had publicly set a firm deadline for the United States, an act virtually unheard of in modern diplomacy. The narrative was clear. Canada had not only resisted American pressure, but had gone on the offensive, creating a situation where the United States had little choice but to act under scrutiny from the world. Every minute Trump delayed or hesitated, the optics worsened, painting the U.S. as reactive, indecisive, and vulnerable. The Pentagon, too, was in alarm mode. Military planners expressed deep concern over Carney's threat to dissolve NORAD and sever joint defense operations. Losing the Canadian defense partnership would create massive blind spots across North America, particularly in Arctic airspace, where early warning systems are critical. Intelligence officials warned that Canada's plans to coordinate defense operations through NATO partners and European allies could bypass traditional U.S. oversight entirely. The White House had previously assumed control over continental defense. Now, the assumption was being challenged by a single Canadian leader, and the implications were dire. Behind closed doors, Trump was reportedly considering the political cost of compliance versus confrontation. Advisors warned that failing to meet Canada's demands could trigger not just economic collapse, but a constitutional and political crisis. Yet complying fully would be politically humiliating, an acknowledgement that the United States had been forced to surrender to a smaller neighbor under public scrutiny. Every option carried extreme consequences, and Carney had engineered the perfect storm, a decision trap that cornered the president while making it impossible to back down without global embarrassment. Carney's strategic brilliance was evident in the timeline itself. 14 days was the perfect window, short enough that Trump could not delay without global attention, long enough that he could not claim surprise. By placing the deadline midweek, Carney ensured that markets would remain open, allowing immediate reflection of any U.S. inaction in stock and energy prices. The first quarter reporting period compounded the pressure, as companies would be forced to report potential losses due to Canadian actions, intensifying scrutiny from investors, congressmen, and the media. As NATO members and global markets digested the ultimatum, the United States was left isolated. Every ally recognized that Canada had leverage and prepared contingencies. Every domestic stakeholder, companies, financial institutions, and military branches began to calculate exposure and risk. Trump's administration had expected to dictate terms. Instead, the United States found itself scrambling to avoid disaster, reacting to a Canadian strategy designed for maximum leverage and precision. By the end of Section 2, the reality was unmistakable. Carney had not only humiliated Trump, but had reshaped the battlefield of North American politics. Canada was no longer defending. It was dictating, and every hour brought the United States closer to a choice that could redefine the continent. The countdown had begun, and March 18th loomed larger with every passing moment, promising either unprecedented capitulation or catastrophic confrontation. Carney's 14-day ultimatum was not a bluff. Within hours of his address, analysts began breaking down exactly what Canada could do if the United States refused to comply, and the picture was grim. The first and most immediate lever was energy. Canada is the largest supplier of oil, natural gas, and electricity to the United States. Carney made it clear that if his demands were unmet, all energy exports could be halted. This was not a threat of negotiation, it was a fully operational plan. Analysts projected that halting Canadian oil exports alone would spike U.S. gasoline prices by double digits within weeks. Gas stations across the Midwest and Northeast would face shortages, industries reliant on natural gas would be forced to curtail production, and electricity-dependent sectors from manufacturing to tech could experience crippling outages. Next, Carney threatened withdrawal from the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, a move that would instantly dismantle preferential trade benefits. U.S. companies that had relied on tariff-free access to Canadian markets would suddenly face punitive tariffs under World Trade Organization rules. Economists warned this could cost American businesses billions in lost revenue, disrupt supply chains, and create cascading failures across multiple industries. Manufacturing hubs dependent on Canadian components could see shutdowns, while agriculture exports like wheat and corn could face immediate market collapse. Every dollar of Canadian exports cut off from the U.S. economy represented a pressure point Carney had carefully calculated to maximize impact. Airspace and maritime restrictions were the third and equally terrifying consequence. Carney explicitly stated that Canada could close its airspace to U.S. commercial and military aircraft without explicit flight-by-flight approval. Shipping routes, including the St. Lawrence Seaway and Northwest Passage, could be sealed to U.S.-flagged vessels. The implications were enormous. American airlines would face longer routes and higher fuel costs, cargo shipments would slow dramatically, and insurance rates for U.S. shipping companies would skyrocket. These logistical disruptions alone could ripple through the U.S. economy, increasing costs for goods and services nationwide. Financial decoupling represented the fourth layer of pressure. Carney revealed that Canada had prepared measures to remove Canadian investment from U.S. financial markets, requiring pension funds and institutional investors to divest over a 24-month period and to impose currency controls limiting the convertibility of Canadian dollars into U.S. dollars. This would drain approximately $480 billion from U.S. markets, destabilizing the stock market and financial institutions. Such a withdrawal would be unprecedented, shaking confidence in U.S. assets and prompting potential global financial repercussions. Carney's message was clear. The U.S. could no longer assume the stability of its financial ties with Canada. Military separation was the fifth consequence, striking at the heart of continental defense. Carney threatened to dissolve NORAD, cancel joint exercises, and withdraw Canadian forces from U.S. facilities. Without Canadian cooperation, early warning systems in the Arctic would be compromised, intelligence sharing would slow, and coordinated defense against external threats could become impossible. Military planners in Washington reportedly labeled this as one of the most dangerous potential outcomes, warning that the U.S. would be left vulnerable in its Northern Hemisphere defense strategy. Carney's move was not only economic, it was strategically designed to undermine the U.S. military's assumption of continental superiority. Finally, Carney hinted at a coordinated alliance against U.S. economic coercion. Canada would work with Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand to establish a framework to counteract any future U.S. pressure. This would include joint trade protections, coordinated sanctions against aggressive tariffs, and alternative financial and trade systems that could bypass U.S. participation entirely. The message was unmistakable. If Trump refused, Canada could isolate the United States on multiple fronts, turning what had been a bilateral dispute into a global challenge for American dominance. As the hours passed, international reactions began to pour in. Within 90 minutes, the European Union issued a statement backing Canada's position, calling the 5 demands reasonable and appropriate. Germany, France, and the UK echoed this sentiment, indicating they would support Canada if the US failed to comply. Markets in Europe responded cautiously, with investors noting that Canadian energy could be redirected to European buyers, mitigating Canadian losses while amplifying US pain. Japan and South Korea reportedly expressed interest in participating in alternative trade networks, signaling that Canada's diplomatic reach had extended far beyond the immediate North American theater. In Washington, the reaction was pure chaos. Senior officials scrambled to calculate worst-case scenarios. The combination of halted energy exports, financial decoupling, trade disruption, and military separation could trigger a recession within weeks. Wall Street began pricing in the likelihood of severe market shocks. Energy companies, industrial manufacturers, and utilities issued emergency briefings, warning that if Canada followed through, the cost to American households and businesses would be catastrophic. Reports indicate that Trump's advisors convened repeated meetings to weigh compliance against national pride, each option carrying near impossible political consequences. Inside NATO, officials watched with growing concern. Carney's delivery at a NATO press briefing had amplified the stakes, making the international community witnesses to the ultimatum. The implicit message was that Canada's alternatives were viable and globally supported, meaning the United States could not rely on secretive pressure tactics to force compliance. The optics were damaging, a smaller nation dictating terms to the most powerful superpower on the world stage. By the end of Section 3, the magnitude of Carney's strategy became clear. Every demand was backed by operational measures, every threat was credible, and every potential consequence had been calculated to exert maximum pressure on Trump. Markets, militaries, and international allies all had their eyes on March 18th. For the United States, the clock was ticking, options were narrowing, and the consequences of inaction, or miscalculation, could redefine global power dynamics. Carney had not just issued an ultimatum, he had engineered a geopolitical trap from which retreat would be nearly impossible. By mid-afternoon, the reality of Carney's ultimatum had fully hit Washington. Trump's administration reportedly entered what insiders described as a state of controlled panic. The National Security Council convened multiple emergency sessions, but discussions were chaotic. Advisors debated whether Carney's threats were credible, but intelligence reports confirmed that Canada had fully prepared for every eventuality. Supply chains were ready to be rerouted, energy contracts with Europe and Asia were already in place, and alternative military arrangements were coordinated with NATO allies. The U.S. could no longer assume leverage. Canada had eliminated any effective counters. Trump's political team faced an impossible calculus. Meeting all 5 demands would be an unprecedented public humiliation, demonstrating that the United States had been forced to capitulate to a smaller nation. Yet, refusing to comply could trigger economic devastation, energy shortages, financial market collapse, and a strategic vacuum in North American defense. According to sources, Trump asked repeatedly whether there was any action that could inflict greater pain on Canada than Canada could impose on the U.S. The answer, his advisors reluctantly confirmed, was no. Canada had meticulously prepared every contingency, ensuring that any U.S. retaliation would fail before it could begin. Wall Street's reaction mirrored the panic in the White House. In the hours following Carney's speech, energy futures spiked, reflecting the potential loss of Canadian oil, gas, and electricity exports. Utilities warned of possible rolling power outages, and industrial manufacturers calculated immediate supply disruptions. Analysts projected that financial markets could lose nearly $500 billion if Canada executed even half of its threatened measures. Investors scrambled to hedge against currency controls, divestment of Canadian capital, and the broader disruption of trade. Every ticker reflected uncertainty, volatility, and a growing sense that Carney's ultimatum was fully actionable. The Pentagon's alarm escalated with each passing hour. Military planners emphasized that dissolving NORAD and ending joint exercises would create gaps in continental defense that could take years to repair. Early warning systems in the Arctic would be compromised. And intelligence sharing critical to homeland security could be delayed or rerouted through European allies. In essence, Canada's threat was not just economic, it was strategic, undermining the U.S. military's traditional superiority in the hemisphere. Reports indicate that senior military officials prepared formal briefings for Trump, explicitly warning that ignoring Carney's demands could have consequences as severe as a direct military threat. Meanwhile, international reactions amplified U.S. vulnerability. The European Union publicly endorsed Canada's demands, calling them reasonable and necessary to preserve sovereignty and stability. France, Germany, and the UK echoed the statement. signaling unified backing for Canada if the United States failed to comply. Asia-Pacific powers, including Japan, South Korea, and Australia, reportedly signaled interest in supporting Canada through trade partnerships and alternative supply chains. For Trump, the optics were devastating. The United States, the world's preeminent power, found itself isolated while a smaller ally not only stood firm but had global support to enforce its demands. Carney's strategic genius became clearer with the timeline he set. 14 days is long enough that Trump cannot claim surprise, but short enough that delaying action would be politically impossible. By positioning the deadline mid-week, Carney ensured that markets would react in real time, forcing immediate consequences for inaction. The proximity to the end of the fiscal quarter meant U.S. companies would have to report potential losses caused by Canadian measures, adding additional pressure from investors, shareholders, and congressional oversight. Every component of Carney's plan was calculated to force rapid U.S. compliance or punish hesitation in the harshest way possible. In Washington, officials debated possible scenarios. One group urged partial compliance, remove tariffs, commit to NORAD, but refuse compensation and sovereignty acknowledgments. Another faction argued full compliance to avoid market collapse and energy shortages. Every scenario carried catastrophic consequences for Trump's political standing. Capitulation would humiliate him on a global stage. Partial compliance would leave unresolved vulnerabilities. Refusal could trigger economic meltdown and even strategic instability in continental defense. Trump's advisors repeatedly warned that the window to act was closing fast, and any misstep could have consequences that last well beyond his presidency. Energy companies issued urgent internal reports. Utilities dependent on Canadian electricity began contingency planning, estimating blackouts or emergency load shedding if Canada acted. Oil and gas traders factored in immediate disruptions to pipelines and tanker shipments, calculating cost spikes in real time. Industrial manufacturers, from automotive to electronics, began assessing supply chain vulnerabilities. Every industry connected to Canadian exports or energy infrastructure suddenly found itself on high alert. Carney had managed to create a scenario in which almost every sector of the U.S. economy could be impacted within days, with cascading consequences that would ripple globally. The military and strategic implications were equally severe. With NORAD potentially dissolved and joint exercises canceled, U.S. forces in Alaska and northern Canada would be operating in isolation. Intelligence sharing with Canada, previously taken for granted, would require new arrangements through NATO partners, slowing response times and creating blind spots in continental security. Even routine exercises could become logistically impossible, forcing the Pentagon to consider long-term structural changes in defense planning. Carney's ultimatum was now a credible threat to both the U.S. economy and military readiness, leaving Trump trapped between humiliation and crisis. By the end of Section 4, the pressure on Trump was unbearable. Every U.S. sector, political, economic, and military, was vulnerable. Every ally was observing, every market was watching, and Carney had positioned Canada as the power dictating terms. The clock to March 18th had begun ticking. The United States faced a historic choice: comply, partially comply, or confront total chaos. The stakes could not have been higher, and the suspense gripping Washington, NATO, and global markets was nearly palpable. Carney had not just issued an ultimatum, he had orchestrated a geopolitical storm from which there was no easy escape. March 18th loomed like a ticking bomb over Washington. With each passing hour, the reality of Carney's 14-day ultimatum pressed harder on the White House. Trump's advisors reportedly held back-to-back emergency briefings, each one more alarming than the last. The questions dominating every room were urgent and chilling. Will Canada follow through? Can the United States absorb the economic and strategic consequences? And what will the global community think if we fail to act? Every option carried immense risk. Every choice threatened lasting humiliation or catastrophic loss. The first possible outcome was total capitulation. Faced with energy shortages, financial market collapse, trade disruption, and the potential dissolution of NORAD, Trump could have been forced to comply fully with Carney's 5 demands. Tariffs removed, NORAD commitments reaffirmed, compensation paid, sovereignty recognized, every demand met. Politically, this would have been devastating for Trump. His authority and global image would be shattered. America's dominance over Canada would be publicly reversed, broadcast to allies, adversaries, and media outlets worldwide. The optics alone would have crippled his aura of strength, even if the crisis itself was temporarily resolved. The second scenario was partial compliance. Trump might have attempted a compromise, removing tariffs and securing NORAD, but refusing to issue full compensation or retract sovereignty threats. Carney's team had anticipated this, outlining scaled consequences that would hit in proportion to U.S. inaction. Energy exports could be reduced by 50%, financial decoupling partially implemented, and USMCA withdrawal could begin with transition measures. The U.S. would suffer economic pain, strategic gaps, and global embarrassment while claiming partial victory. Both sides would appear to win, but the underlying power dynamic would have permanently shifted, with Canada now clearly in a position of authority. The third, most extreme scenario was the total break. If Trump refused to comply with any of Carney's demands, Canada would implement all threatened measures simultaneously. Energy exports halted entirely, financial decoupling executed, trade restrictions imposed, and military cooperation severed. NORAD would dissolve, leaving gaps in early warning systems across the Arctic. Global markets would react violently, stocks plunging, commodities spiking, and supply chains collapsing. Economists warned that within 30 days the U.S. could face recession, energy crises, and strategic isolation. Politically, Trump would be forced into a corner, resign, face congressional action to override his policies, or endure a constitutional and economic crisis of unprecedented scale. Inside the White House, sources reported that Trump spent hours weighing the political, economic, and strategic consequences. Advisors presented models showing worst-case scenarios, potential market crashes, and military vulnerabilities. Lobbyists and corporate leaders reportedly pushed for compliance, emphasizing the cascading effects on U.S. companies, jobs, and infrastructure. Intelligence officials warned that ignoring Carney could permanently erode U.S. credibility among NATO allies and global partners. Every passing minute made the decision more urgent and the consequences more severe. Meanwhile, international reactions amplified the pressure. Europe remained firmly aligned with Canada, signaling that any unilateral U.S. action against Canadian measures would be diplomatically isolated. Asia-Pacific nations prepared to participate in alternative trade and energy networks, while NATO members quietly assessed how a Canadian-led defense strategy could operate independently of the United States. Trump had expected leverage, intimidation, and negotiation. Instead, he faced a united global front backing a smaller nation against the world's most powerful superpower. The optics were devastating, the stakes unparalleled, and the clock merciless. Markets reflected the tension in real time. Traders monitored energy futures, stock indices, and currency valuations, anticipating immediate repercussions from Canada's measures. Each hour without resolution magnified uncertainty. U.S. companies dependent on Canadian inputs issued internal advisories, while utilities and energy grids prepared emergency responses. Analysts warned that if Carney's threats were implemented in full, the ripple effects would be felt globally, with supply chain disruptions, financial shocks, and strategic recalibrations affecting every major economy. As the countdown continued, the world watched. Carney had done more than issue demands. He had engineered a high-stakes trap with precision timing, credible threats, and global support. The United States faced a moment of choice unlike any in modern history: comply fully and suffer political humiliation, comply partially and endure permanent vulnerability, or refuse and risk economic, strategic, and political catastrophe. Carney's ultimatum had succeeded in every dimension. It commanded attention, forced the U.S. into reaction, and demonstrated Canada's resolve to defend its sovereignty at any cost. By the final hours before the March 18th deadline, tension gripped Washington, Ottawa, and capitals around the world. Every advisor, investor, diplomat, and military planner was watching. Every decision made or delayed would have monumental consequences. Carney had redrawn the geopolitical map. The United States, despite its size and power, was now on the defensive. Canada, a nation long underestimated by its neighbor, had proven it could dictate terms, enforce them with precision, and do so with global backing. The clock was ticking, and when March 18th arrived, the world would witness either a historic act of surrender, a precarious compromise, or the first domino in a crisis that could reshape North America forever. The stage is set. The players are in position. Carney has spoken. Trump now has 14 days to decide whether to respond with compliance, partial compliance, or defiance, and each choice carries consequences that will be studied by historians for decades. The countdown has begun, and no one, not Trump, not the White House, not global markets, can ignore it.